I'm hoping to talk about my book project, do a few boring slides, which is going to be kind of the lit review slides. I'll do that. But then I'll also kind of sprinkled in will be some slides about current events. And then I really hope to engage into like what I hopefully will be an exciting question and answer period. All right, so let's get into it. All right, so the past 3 years of turmoil in American politics has made visible what many of us have already known, right? That Black lives are not treated as equal and the state is often responsible for their deaths. Protests have, of course, erupted across the country. Chanting Black Lives Matter, activists have taken to streets in big cities such as New York and in smaller cities such as Ferguson to bring attention to police misconduct and the killing of Black citizens by private individuals and also by law enforcement. This past week after the devastating election, many more people took to the streets to protest what they felt were increased levels of racism, misogyny, xenophobia, nativism. The growing movement raises important questions about the usefulness of protest as a strategy to increase government accountability and to reform a profoundly unjust system. A central question that sits I feel like, especially in the past week and over the past few years, is can protests actually shift political institutions? All right, very connectedly here is a question about the role of citizens. Citizens by themselves, as one, and also citizens organized together. The fight to protect Black lives, that's my good news and bad news, is not new, and it's been successful. So what I'm going to do just very quickly in this next slide is to tell a very brief story about an important Supreme Court case that sits at the center of my book, and then we're going to launch into the larger work around it. All right, so at the centerpiece of my book is a Supreme Court case called Moore v. Dempsey. It was decided by the Supreme Court in 1923. The case involved 12 African-American men. They were sharecroppers in Arkansas who were sentenced to die by the electric chair. They each received a trial that lasted less than 10 minutes in a courtroom occupied by a mob of menacing white racists who threatened the jury that if the jury didn't convict them to die, then they would then lynch the jury, right? 5 years, however, so the NAACP gets involved in investigating this case and then litigating this case. 5 years later, the men are freed, and we have this really important case called Moore v. Dempsey. All right, so let's get to some of these facts. When the Supreme Court handed down its decision, the Supreme Court declared that the conviction of these men to die by the electric chair was unconstitutional. They did that by saying that mob-dominated trials violated the Equal Protection Clause. It violated due process. And this was extraordinary on so many levels. One, and this is going to be the big thing, is that these hasty death sentences, also known as Jim Crow trials in the South, were often widely accepted practices since the end of legal slavery. In this context, state criminal trials were typically to be considered to be immune from federal court oversight. After this case, the Supreme Court moves forward in a number of really important landmark criminal procedure decisions and transforms the role of the federal government, especially in state criminal court trials in the South, but also the North. So Moore v. Dempsey, before this case, and this is an important point to understand, is that the federal government was not involved in state criminal court trials, right? So Georgia had a different system than New York did, a different system from Arkansas, right? And so this is going to be the first case where the federal government is actually mob-dominated trials, right, that might violate, right, the Constitution, right? So but it's an important case that at least set that motion, set the court in motion. All right, so this is going to be, so we're going to bracket this, we're going to come back to this in the last third of my talk today. But this is the case, again, that sits at the centerpiece here and created a number of questions for me in terms of what I knew about civil rights history and what I knew about constitutional rights. All right. So like I said, the case, I stumbled upon it in my early archive work. and it created a number of questions that I could not answer with the available literature. So there's 3 questions that I take up that kind of sit at the center of my book. The first is, can civil rights organizations impact the development of the American state? Why did the Supreme Court begin to wrestle power away from state courts in the area of criminal law in 1923 with the case Moore v. Dempsey? And perhaps kind of this other important question here about where is it? Oh, this second one. What explains the enlarging of the federal court system in the United States in the 20th century, right? So if we know that federal judicial power expands in the 20th century, how did this happen? Why is this the case? Part of my work here is a belief that by pushing the timeline back further, the timeline of civil rights in the Supreme Court, I want to ask if our memories of civil rights history changes as well in terms of the timeline, the agenda, and the heroes of the movement. And then I also want to question, if we push the timeline back, what types of new stories does that open up? And how does that inform our imagination about how to fight for rights today? Okay. All right, so the argument that I make in this book, I think it's kind of, let me just say a little bit about this, because it intercedes in a number of very important and well-established existing literatures. And what I do is I place the NAACP and their work around this case at the center of understanding the building of the 20th century American state and federal judicial power. All right, so first I argue the NAACP's campaign against lynching and mob violence marks the beginning of the long civil rights movement, not Brown v. Board of Education, as so many scholars uncritically assume, and I'm going to go back to this in a minute as well. Second, I argue that bottom-up change shapes state formation, that the current focus on top-down change from institutions has been far too narrow. Thus, accounts of political development need to decenter the role of political institutions and delete political actors in our understanding of change. And third, I argue the NAACP is politicized and active at the federal level at a time when previous scholarship suggests that Black organizations were inactive at the federal level. Using the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign, I determined the NAACP played a pivotal role in the growth of federal court power and subsequently in civil rights by helping the Supreme Court wrestle away jurisdiction from state courts in the first quarter of the 20th century. The book focuses on the extent of the NAACP's efforts to shift public opinion and then in pushing the legislative and executive branches of the federal government in a direction that they were not yet willing to go. Finally, I argue that when these attempts failed to produce any substantive federal protection, the NAACP redirected its campaign to the Supreme Court, where they took up the landmark case Moore v. Dempsey. All right, so let's talk about why perhaps that this is missing, right? So kind of this account that I've just kind of described to you about what I want to do here, it's not really told in the mainstream literature in civil rights. So why is that the case? And I'm going to talk about some of my work here. And kind of a lot of the established work. All right, but I think that it should, right? So even though it doesn't count for it, I think that it should. So I make that case in this book, or I think I do. All right. So through a historical focus on political and legal institutions, scholars working in this tradition have drawn attention to a range of structural transformations that have defined the American system of governance. Some of the most famous works in American political development, that's like my subfield in American political science, right, have produced studies linking institutional governance to industrialization, party development, capitalism, and social policy formation. I often explain American political development in terms of kind of this type of work to my students as if we understand that the powers of the presidency are not the same today, are not the same as the founding, American political development scholars are often interested in this larger question about how did things change over time. Unlike traditional approaches in political science that have tended to rely on a static picture of American politics, American political development has routinely asked big questions about how institutions form, identifying the mechanisms that produce stability and change over time. Yet despite broadening our understanding of the way that political authority works, the way that scholars in American political development have narrated the formation of an American civil rights tradition has overlooked the role that individuals and grassroots organizations have played in shaping the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. It's not that scholars have so much ignored civil rights mobilization. Numerous American political development scholars have investigated the role of community-level civil rights mobilization and its impact on the American state in the post-World War II era. But this scholarship typically uses a top-down focused narrative and usually identifies transformations in United States foreign policy and party politics as a causal explanation for the formation of a domestic civil rights agenda. From this perspective, national security concerns and not necessarily civil rights mobilization gave the federal government an incentive to promote social change at home during the Cold War period. As for the literature in my favorite field, public law, or like law in courts, that addresses the Supreme Court's involvement in early criminal procedure cases, it often says that the Supreme Court responds to egregious miscarriages of justice, right? And so it often, especially when we look at kind of the modern criminal procedure revolution in terms of a number of big cases decided in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, especially attending to huge miscarriages of injustice in the South, that it often says, right, that these cases, the facts of these cases were just so horrible that the Supreme Court had no choice but to decide these cases in this manner, right, to protect Black defendants, right? It's a narrative that very much plays on American notions of liberalism, right, that at the end of the day, we are better than kind of the worst of ourselves, right? And so in terms of Morvey Dempsey, the interesting thing is that in all the law books that I had read in undergrad and in graduate school about this case, it was like, yo, you know what? These 12 men, these innocent men were going to be sentenced to die. And of course the Supreme Court came in, right? It's kind of these defenders of justice, right? So that's often also the story that is told in the area of public law. This, of course, raises a question here, but what about the impact of civil rights mobilization in the period of American political and constitutional development before World War II, right? On this question, the literature in American politics is largely silent about civil rights mobilization. The silence is supported by much scholarship in African American studies that provides a narrative of African American political activism in national politics that exists within the bounds of Reconstruction and in the period post-1950s. The period in the middle, so the period in the middle of Reconstruction in the 1940s, 1950s, right, is considered to be a time of African American inaction on the federal level of politics. It's often, as many people know in this room, right, it's often considered kind of the nadir of race relations in this country, this period, which I'm fascinated by. The traditional account of African American freedom kind of struggle follows roughly along these lines. After the abolition of slavery, the brief period known as Reconstruction came about, and African Americans enjoyed, right, kind of unprecedented levels of kind of political and economic freedom that they had never seen before. Of course, we know, right, that Redeemer Democrats then take control and institute home rule, right, and then African Americans then turn inward through and focus on fraternal organizations in the church, get organized, and then we see an explosion of civil rights mobilization and activism in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that shake this nation, right, and that force our nation at some level, right, to pass new laws and make us to become a better country. All right. During the almost, however, 75-year period before, right, kind of the heyday of the civil rights movement, African Americans are assumed to have turned inward to promote their interest through African American institutions. Numerous social historians have beautifully, of course, documented how African Americans resisted Jim Crow at the local and at the state level, but not at the national level. Political scientists, for the most part, have accepted this narrative of African American political activism. These two strands are, of course, I believe, kind of mutually reinforcing. Important changes in the development of the American state are attributed to overarching institutional structures, not citizen agency. African Americans, by default, are not even considered important enough to wrestle with in constructing narratives of political development in the early 20th century. Simply put, African Americans were sidelined in national politics from the period of Reconstruction to around the 1940s, so of course they had no role in shaping the American state at the national level during this period. But when we look at African American politics and American political and constitutional development as irreconcilable fields of research, it creates a blind spot that obscures a very important moment in the construction of the American state. And yet, it is precisely at this point, kind of this period, that I think we should probe deeper. I specifically propose a new understanding of this interaction between African American politics and American political and constitutional development. So if the scholarship at some level on civil rights and African Americans is on one side of the spectrum, and the literature on American political and constitutional development is on the other side, what I do in this book is I try to put these works together. And to create kind of a new understanding of African American politics, citizen agency, and American political and constitutional development. It does that by examining the activities of the NAACP in the first quarter of the 20th century in changing public opinion, working with members of Congress, and working with American presidents in the first quarter of the 20th century, right? The broader, what I hope, theoretical contribution of this project is a reorientation of how to think about citizens, marginalized citizens, and change. All right. So I've also spent a long time in thinking about kind of like, why is this the case, right? Like, why do we think this? So just I have a very quick slide for people who like fell asleep during like my literature stuff. All right. So I think part of the issue, right, in terms of this traditional narrative is at some level cemented by Hollywood, right? So we have, this is in terms of my students, right? They're like, yep, slavery, and then we have like organizing, right? So then we have Selma, and then we also have Butler, right? And it's this narrative, right, that things are bad, and then things are great, people organize, and then we get change, right? But like, again, even in kind of at least in terms of the national conversation around these things, there is this huge gap between this period and that period. So I like this thing. I got a little amen corner over there. I appreciate that. All right. So what I often say is the wrong way. Okay, so let's talk about here in terms of the problem, what I think this kind of triumphant narrative, right? I think that there's a lot of problems here in the sense, and so let me say a quick thing about why I think that this is wrong and why I think at some level this is problematic, especially to rights organizing, or at least imagining rights organizing today. It tells us in some way that there was only one way that change happened, nonviolent direct action, and that change is ultimately somewhat swift, and America ultimately will align her institutions with her cherished ideals, if people just stand up and fight. My worry with this story is that it props up one narrow vision of civil rights, making and blinds us to the very long process of change and a range of different strategies that perhaps lie outside of courts. Unlike previous research, my book demonstrates the importance, I think an often forgotten role, of civil rights organizations have played in the national state building project. My research reveals that by taking a step back and examining the antecedents to change in the political and social environment, then we'll see the critical role of the NAACP. So when we pay attention and trace the role of the NAACP and the impact of Black political actors, what do we see? And and also the central question here is why is the NAACP so concerned with racial violence? And so let me say a little bit about here. So what I'm now going to be moving to talk about, moving away from the case, moving away from this lit review, is talking very much about the NAACP's campaign against racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century, right? And so again, in contextualizing kind of this movement here around Black Lives Matter, it's not the first time that Blacks got organized around the protection of Black lives from private individuals and also from law enforcement, right? And so let me say a little bit about why I think that this is also really interesting. I really don't need to do this slide anymore. I used to always present this slide. Okay, quick story. So I finished my graduate work at Princeton in 2008. What else happened in 2008? Obama was elected, right? And I somehow wrote this dissertation about racial violence. And I defended in November of 2008. And I could not get a job. Because people were like, no, we're not at this moment anymore. Why did this woman write this depressing, out of touch dissertation? This is no longer an issue anymore. right? So it was like, so then there's more slides in this, but I actually had to prove that African Americans were organized around this issue of racial violence, about the killing of black bodies. And so there was actually slides in which I even had to, my advisors would tell me to take out, because they were like, I think it's gonna be too much for white people. And I was like, really? Really? Like, this is actually a part of history, right? So anyways, this is one of the slides that I used to actually make the case that racial violence was an incredibly important issue for the NAACP. So what I did here is I content coded, and 1911 is gonna be the first full year that the NAACP will keep board minutes. These are board of director minutes. And so what I did is I like, you know, it's just me kind of like going through these archives. And I'm like seeing these things, but I'm not really seeing what we traditionally think about when we talk about the NAACP and when we talk about civil rights. And so what I started to do then was just for each month, it's not in terms of the many times they said it, but just for each month I've listed a particular concern. In terms of criminal justice, when I say criminal justice, they're often referring to mob violence and lynchings and trying to organize about what the NAACP can do around this. All right, so and there's this quote that I like to use too also to try to bring this home. From the very beginning, the NAACP in 1909, lynching and mob violence were at the top of their issue agenda, since racial violence was considered to be the greatest obstacle that African Americans in the North and in the South faced to gaining equality in America. In response to criticism from another board member that the NAACP's kind of agenda, program of advancement was not radical enough, that it also didn't address other areas that we now associate with civil rights, such as education, voting, and labor, one of the NAACP leaders explained, and this is a quote here, "All the American Negro wanted was a chance to live without a rope around his neck," end quote. The NAACP believed that before the organization could appropriately address other areas that we now justifiably associate with civil rights, that the NAACP had to first focus on protecting the right to live, because education and voting would mean very little if African Americans were not alive to enjoy these types of freedoms. And so that's in terms of, and so that I went through and I had to make this case, and some people like, you know, I mean now everybody's like, oh my gosh, racial violence is an issue, horribly. All right, so the NAACP was originally founded in response to lynching and mob violence, not primarily to respond to the fight for education equality. In the voluminous literature that is written about civil rights and constitutional law, there exists not one account that has detailed at length the theoretical and political stakes of the NAACP's campaign against racial violence. It's a stunning missive and says a lot about power dynamics and the way that history is produced, and for so long, our collective ignorance about the power of racist violence in this country. This neglect means that causal explanations focused on describing constitutional and civil rights development are often incomplete. All right. So what is the NAACP going to do? Many people, especially over the past few years, I've seen, right, in terms of social media, I've seen this picture. This picture is outside of the NAACP's offices in New York City. What they did here was, when they got word that somebody was lynched, they would wave this flag outside of their offices in New York City. So how to fight for civil rights. And I think one of the interesting things that myself and a number of other civil rights historians kind of wrestle with, especially ones who focus on kind of an earlier time. Today when I say civil rights, there's this kind of a certain narrative that jumps to your mind. There's certain institutions that we know that we go to. But how do you fight for civil rights before there's civil rights? Right? It's kind of this weird, very kind of difficult exercise that I often do with myself. Right? Before there's a knowledge that the Supreme Court will actually provide some relief, right, to black litigants, how do you actually fight for civil rights? And so this is the fascinating thing about what the NAACP is doing in the first quarter of the 20th century, is that there's this huge belief at some level in American democracy and freedom, right? That they can change the structures of this government. And so what they do is they construct this movement, and at some level, there's this belief that, you know, we can change public opinion. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then also, then they move to change institutions. And I do want to say that I can never ever talk about the NAACP without talking about Ida B. Wells. Like that's like also impossible, right? Despite Du Bois's role in silencing her in the organization, right? In terms of why the NAACP is going to be so interested and focused on this issue of racial violence is because of Ida B. Wells' work at the end, right? In terms of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, right? And exploding this myth that the reason why black people are killed is not because they rape white women. That is not the reason, right? And so her investigative journalism work was crucially important in setting the landscape for so many rights organizations that operated in the first kind of 3 decades of the 20th century. What happened, I mean, kind of, and some people obviously know this, kind of the amens that happened, is that she's at kind of the first big meeting, it's called The Call. Everybody comes, and Du Bois doesn't necessarily feel comfortable with her. A number of other white people don't feel comfortable with her radicalism. Both Ida B. Wells and Monroe Trotter are basically kind of pushed out of the NAACP. But in terms to understand the NAACP's work around racial violence and lynching, means to understand, I don't even know if it's, means to understand also her role here. Okay. So what they do, and this is to me also really interesting, is that the NAACP at the beginning is like, you know, the way in which we will fight this injustice is through public opinion, right? That if we can just change the hearts and minds of Americans, they will see how black citizens are treated, and they will want to help end, right, lynching and mob violence. So what they did is in terms of kind of print media and the press, black print media and the press, the Crisis magazine was kind of Du Bois's kind of like baby, right? And it's the NAACP magazine, but he was at the helm, the editor of the Crisis magazine, incredibly influential in the content that went in it and how, and kind of also in its expansion and distribution across the North and the South. Pamphlet publications, so what they did is they collected information and data around lynching in much the way that Ida B. Wells did and distributed it to policymakers, to members of Congress, to white people, to black people across the country. And then also, again, like newspapers were going to be very important here. One of the key things that I think why this slide is especially useful in light of what's happened since last week is the importance of alternate types of media, right, in terms of to get the message out and not to rely fully on mainstream sources of media. So if we can, I think that there's a lot of lessons to draw from the NAACP's campaign against racial violence. They at the very beginning, they never believed that there was kind of one way, right? That it was Congress is gonna be kind of the cure, or that the courts were gonna be the cure. They just pushed on a number of different areas, hoping that something would change. All right, to understand, I think, the level to which the NAACP believed that they could change the hearts and the minds of people, this quote by Du Bois, the most important thing which can be done immediately towards stopping lynching is to gather all the facts of lynching and give them the widest publicity, right? This idea, we must get these facts out there. We gotta let people know. Once we let people know, they'll change, right? And then there's this quote here as well that I enjoy, and this is from the NAACP's 10th annual report. Lynching can be stopped when we reach the hearts and minds of the American people. There was this, up until probably around 1920, 1921, there was a real belief that all you had to do was to reach Americans, and at the base of them were good people, right? Okay. We know that fully did not work out, right? Okay. All right. Let me just do these. All right, so this is probably my most, besides the finding about Morvey Dempsey, Wilson will be my most kind of interesting, surprising finding. I see furrowed brows, right? Okay, so let's say a little bit about this, and I can say more later as well. So after at the same time, they're still working on public opinion, but they believe that what's necessary also is at some level to shake the political establishment, right? That kind of change public opinion on the outside, that's not gonna be enough. So at an early stage in the NAACP strategy against mob violence, the organization targeted the executive branch as a possible institution in the federal government whereby a civil rights agenda could be entrenched. Of course, the president, the highest elected office in the United States, has often appeared impenetrable to marginalized groups, as the obstacles they encounter to getting their message heard are much greater, and the likelihood of success is often lower than the other branches of government. However, in 2 successive presidential administrations, the NAACP garnered unprecedented access to the Oval Office and secured presidential denouncements of lynching and mob violence. President Woodrow Wilson conceded to NAACP demands during his second term, and President Warren G. Harding complied with NAACP requests for a strong statement against lynching as soon as he assumed office. The statements made by Wilson and Harding against lynchings are particularly remarkable because both came from men who initially expressed an unwillingness to publicly address the issue. So let me say a bit about kind of the most curious figure here, Wilson. Wilson's position on America's race question is well known, or at least it appears that way in the available literature. The scholarship examining Wilson's race relations appears to be in agreement that his administration moved the federal government to an unprecedented level of racial segregation and was disastrous to the struggle for equal rights in America. Of course, another body of Wilsonian literature exists which focuses less on Wilson's racial attitude toward African Americans and more squarely on his success in domestic and especially in foreign affairs. Wilson, in these accounts, is considered to be the man who ushered in the modern presidency, and his regressive racial policies are often obfuscated and viewed as a small blemish on an otherwise exceptional presidential legacy. In the national civil rights story, Wilson is pretty much always cast as the villain, especially in this past year, perhaps justifiably. The narrative of Wilson that is told is one of a Southerner who rode into Washington, instituted Jim Crow, segregation in the federal government, legitimated the film Birth of a Nation, and callously refused to meet with civil rights leaders during his tenure in the Oval Office. But what has gone missing is an important complexity in his civil rights legacy, if we can even call it that. President Wilson certainly was no advocate for African Americans, but the tenor of his approach changed around mob violence and lynching in his second term. In particular, after a gruesome massacre of African Americans by whites in East St. Louis, the NAACP organized the largest demonstration of African Americans in the 20th century to that date. 10,000, I'm gonna go to this, I'm gonna come back to this. 10,000 African Americans marched in silence down Fifth Ave in New York City against mob violence and racist oppression. Subsequently, Wilson met with a delegation of the protesters in the Oval Office and promised he would do what he could to stop this type of senseless violence. Directly the day after this big protest march, and so this is, as you can see, this is a picture of women. There's children were marching in front, and then women, and then men were marching with different signs in silence, only to the sound of muffled drums. The day after this, a sizable, they say around 12-person delegation went to the White House. They demanded a meeting with Wilson. They were denied at the time. This is kind of a very quick story behind this. In the same day, he tells his personal secretary that he was moved by the protests and that he believes that he should have an audience with the NAACP and some members of the East St. Louis kind of delegation if he thinks that it would be right. And so what they do, and this is told in James Weldon Johnson's, his autobiography, is that he sits down and he actually meets with them and talks to them and listens to them about what is going on. Afterwards, the NAACP launched a letter writing campaign, and 12,000 also letters flooded the White House requesting Wilson to make a statement against lynching in his address to the nation in July. And so what they're doing kind of at this meeting also is that they're requesting that he would make a statement. He's like, no, right, that's too much. And then this letter writing campaign actually, at some level, we think, had an impact on his decision to actually make a statement against lynching. He also, in his second term, granted clemency to African American soldiers who were terrorized by other white soldiers in Texas. All right. So just a small crinkle, right? All right, so the NAACP is also going to take their campaign to Congress. In January 26th, and so what they're doing here is they have Dyer here, and he's a Republican from Missouri. He sponsors an anti-lynching bill in Congress. This is not the first time. 1921 is not the first time that a bill is like that a bill is in Congress in which, and that when I say an anti-lynching bill in Congress, what it would do would make the perpetrators of lynching of African Americans, it would actually kind of create kind of criminal charges, right? That this type of thing would be against the law. And so we have Dyer here, urged colored people all over the United States to get busy in mass meetings, parades, to focus sentiment, and to get favorable action. What's really interesting, especially in the Johnson archives and also in the NAACP archives, is what a huge, massive effort the NAACP put behind passing this national legislation, right? They really, and all of the correspondence between Johnson, between Walter White, and also Du Bois, they really believed that a change would come through Congress. There's these massive letter writing campaigns to members of Congress that happen as well, and many members of Congress are having meetings with Johnson. He just basically spends all his time in DC. So on January 26, 1922, the House of Representatives gave African Americans a reason to celebrate. So on this day, this is the day in which the bill would be debated on the floor. African Americans filled the gallery of the House of Representatives to watch the floor debate of House Bill 13, which is the anti-lynching bill. They cheered in jubilation. Apparently it was so loud, and if you read the congressional transcripts, you get people being like, shh, be quiet, be quiet. They cheered as House Republicans articulated the threat of lynching and booed loudly as Southern Democrats attributed lynching to the rape of white women. When the vote was counted, the anti-lynching bill passed the House by 2/3 of a vote. It was a rare moment in early 20th century American politics that demonstrated to African Americans that they too could get their voices heard in the national policy-making process, right? For those, of course, who understand the very complicated process, right, in terms of passing legislation and the very disappointing levels of racism in this country. Their effort, even though it passed the House, and this was extraordinary, at the end of the day, it died on the Senate floor, and it would be stopped by a coalition of Southern Democrats. And so Du Bois had this statement here at the beginning of 1923, the manner of the defeat of the Dyer anti-lynching bill emphasizes the fact that the machinery of the United States Senate is antiquated to the point that millions of people may suffer injustice and death on account of it. In all of the papers, in terms of the NAACP leaders, extreme shock and deep, deep levels of disappointment. All right. So the NAACP, right, is working in terms of the public opinion level, trying to change public opinion. They're also trying to get the president to make different presidents to make a statement against lynching, right? Both presidents did. The idea here, of course, in terms of the presidency, was that if the president made a statement, of course Americans would follow. That doesn't happen, right? Okay. And then in terms of also in trying to move Congress. So that didn't happen. So now we're in the court area. All right, so let's talk about, I'm gonna move back to that case Moore v. Dempsey that I said a little bit about at the beginning, and I want to talk about the circumstances that led to that case. All right, so the event that sparked the NAACP's interest in fighting lynching through the law, and this is one of the interesting things, is that today oftentimes when we talk about how to fight civil rights, the courts and the law are always there, but the NAACP was, this was at some level kind of the last institution in which they actually sought relief from, at least kind of this type of effort. All right, so the event that sparked the NAACP's interest in fighting lynching through the law was a violent race massacre in Phillips County, Arkansas in 1919. September of 1919, a small group of African-American men met in a church. And so for those who are also familiar with the deep levels of black sharecropping in the South, oftentimes blacks would work on farms in the South and then they would be cheated out of their wages, right, by greedy white landowners, right? And it was a way to always keep them in some type of bondage. And so what African Americans were doing in Phillips County, Arkansas, these farmers, is they were meeting in a church to try to organize, how do we raise money to get an attorney to defend our rights? And so what happened at this church is that a number of white landowners found out about the meeting of African Americans, And also, right, you have to remember that during this time, the idea about kind of labor organizing and like gatherings of African Americans for their rights, that was very dangerous, right? So what they did in terms of these whites found out, they came, there's 3 different cars, they fired shots into the church. What also happened is that a few of the African Americans had guns and they fired back, all right? So that's gonna be kind of a key thing here. And one white man was actually killed in the crossfire. What ensued in Phillips County, Arkansas, would become the worst display of racial violence up to that point in the 20th century. Over 300 African American men, women, and children were hunted and shot down over the course of 3 days. Thousands were driven from their homes, and the African American section of town was looted and destroyed. Right, and so for those who work around African American history, the summer of 1919 will be the Red Summer. It's called the Red Summer because of how much blood was shed by African Americans, right, and all the kind of the level of terror that African Americans faced. So what happened, of course, when all was said and done, is that 72 African American men were arrested, and the argument that the white establishment in Phillips County made is this idea that this was all instigated and started by these unruly, dangerous African Americans, right? And that at the end of the day, they wanted to kill white people. And so we had to put it down. All right, so you have this, I mean, this is, for me to find this also in the papers, in the Arkansas papers, it was just really, really interesting here. Also, and this wasn't just kind of, this wasn't just a local story. This story was carried in the LA Times and in the New York Times as whites quell racial riot in Phillips County, Arkansas, right? So kind of this deep level of this alternative narrative that is developed. So what to do then? This is actually one of my favorite characters, Walter White, not Breaking Bad, right? Okay. All right. Okay. So let's say a little bit about him. So he was often perceived to be he was black, raised in Atlanta, was often perceived to be white. He had blonde hair and green eyes. What he did is he used at some level his ability to pass as a way to at some level for hashtag do work. And so what he did is Walter White conducted many dangerous lynching investigations all across the South. And so what he would do is, right, so you would have the story about how these blacks were responsible for this type of violence. And then he would go and he would talk to people and he would get the real story from them. And then he would come back, right, to New York and he would report on it in national newspapers. And so this was incredibly important. So what he did here in Arkansas is he did the same thing. He went and he talked to people about the violence that happened. And they told him, they were like, I mean, his accounts are also just really interesting because they're very frank, like, oh yeah, this and this happened, of course, right? We had to stop it. Can you believe what these crazy black people were doing? Obviously, they use a different word. All right, so he's going to be crucial here. One of the interesting things in terms of also how dangerous these investigations were. And so he's there for about 3 days. An African-American boy delivers a note to him, and it's basically, leave town now, they're on to you. And so what he does, he catches the last train out of Phillips County, Arkansas. That same day he gets the note. The train conductor, and this is the story that he tells, the train conductor says, why are you leaving when all the fun is going to begin? And then Walter White says, what are you talking about? He was like, there's word that there's a yellow N-word in town and they're going to hang him up. Right, and so he said the story also that he continues the story and says that it was the scariest train ride of his entire life. All right, so let's talk about the Supreme Court here in terms of what happens. Right, so what the kind of the value here is the articles are published now after his investigation, presentation of another side of the story, and also I mean what's key and the reason why I need this side and I need to tell you about Walter White is because this is not an easy story. This is not an easy story about this huge injustice, and the Supreme Court just wanted to intervene and realize that these things were just so wrong, right? We just really got to complicate so many of the ways in which kind of stories that are told to us. All right. That also just at some level erase the role of black people. Okay. So just very quickly here, the litigation strategy developed by the NAACP's Defense Council was directly focused on, oh my gosh, I got like 6 minutes. Okay, getting the federal government involved. I'm gonna skim through this. So one of the interesting things is that this wasn't the first time that this case hit the Supreme Court, that it was also on the third attempt an appeal to the Supreme Court is actually granted. And so the NAACP, this is going to be the white attorney Moorfield story, and this is going to be the black attorney over here. All right, let's move. Okay, you guys already saw that one. Bam, bam, bam. Okay, good. Now we're here. All right. So I think this is actually useful and interesting. So the NAACP in this case, in terms of its argument, is going to couch its legal arguments for federal court intervention in terms of the 14th Amendment's due process protection, citing violation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. By the state of Arkansas, the NAACP brief in the United States Supreme Court made a strong case that the influence of the mob on the court and the jury prevented the defendants from receiving a fair trial. By virtue of mob domination of court, counsel, and jury, the NAACP argued the court in Arkansas, quote, lost its jurisdiction, and the result was but an empty ceremony, carried through in the apparent form of law, and that the verdict of the jury was really a mob verdict, dictated by the spirit of the mob and returned because no other verdict would have been tolerated, and that the judgment against them is therefore a nullity, end quote. By showing that Arkansas was using criminal law to deny African Americans civil liberties, the NAACP played a critical role in helping the Supreme Court to see the inability of state courts to appropriately handle issues at the intersection of race and justice. In making this argument, the NAACP provided federal courts, I believe, with an appealing opportunity to take up a state criminal case. And on February 19th, 1923, the Supreme Court delivered its opinion. Oliver Wendell Holmes with that great mustache with the handlebars, right? That's him. All right. Okay. So this brings me to the final part of my talk. Why? Why did this Supreme Court decision hold so much significance, not just for the NAACP, but for the development of the American political and legal systems in the 20th century? The answer, I think, can be found in the end goal: the creation of an NAACP litigation strategy to fight for civil rights in the rest of the 20th century, and more importantly, the modern criminal procedure revolution, where the Supreme Court greatly expanded its powers in criminal law and redefined what constituted a fair trial. I believe it is important to understand the structure and expertise of the NAACP that allowed it to play the role that it did during the Brown era of civil rights, and that it's important to understand that it was determined by an earlier set of events that set it down that path. From an organizational standpoint, it was the political and legal battle around racial violence that began to shift the understanding of the NAACP and their supporters about how to successfully fight for racial justice in the federal government. The NAACP wasted little time in using Moore v. Dempsey as leverage for funding appeals for their departments. From 1923 to 1924, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund grew from $120 to over $1,000. This figure, of course, doesn't seem like much today, but it represents a near 600% increase in 1 year, which was really, really critical for the NAACP. However, it wasn't just the NAACP's leadership that was affected. The supporters of the NAACP were acutely aware of the impact of this case. And the year after Moore v. Dempsey was decided, the NAACP noted, and this is a quote here, in 1924, there came from all parts of the United States appeals for legal aid. In the 12 months ending December 31st, these cases reached a total of 476. The NAACP reported taking action in most of the cases. All right, moving forwards, I have like 2 more slides after this. Moving away from the trajectory of federal civil rights agenda and returning to my discussion about the enlarging of the national judiciary, the NAACP's efforts to litigate Moore v. Dempsey deserve credit for building up the power of the federal judiciary. Moore v. Dempsey was the first case of the modern era to create new procedural rights in criminal cases when the Supreme Court interpreted the Due Process Clause to forbid convictions obtained through mob-dominated trials. In the final analysis, what the NAACP struggle against racial violence teaches us is that the American state does not hold a monopoly on the use of force, and that institutions can become places where state actors and marginalized groups renegotiate power. But simply institutional development derives from the tension between powerful actors and those who contest and critique the projects they seek to implement. The NAACP made a strong case for the growth of federal government authority by drawing attention to the persistence of racial violence and the inability of states to appropriately punish those responsible. The effort that culminated in the landmark Supreme Court decision, Moore v. Dempsey, in particular exemplifies how the NAACP created opportunities for Black civil society to challenge Jim Crow, and how the organization ultimately pushed the federal government in a new direction. It set them at some level on a new path. These were ordinary African-American citizens, sharecroppers and teachers and domestic workers and store owners, unwilling to sit idly by and watch the escalation of injustice, but equipped with an unrelenting, at some level, belief that the United States' best days were ahead. These citizen actors contested the boundaries of what it meant to live in a democracy in which government purports to care for all of its citizens. The Supreme Court's decision in Moore chipped away at an enshrined system of white supremacy, disrupting the presumption that Southern states ought to be the sole architects of policies involving the intersection of race and justice. Thanks.